Good morning, folks, and welcome. I'm Rick Singleton, Provost of Queen's College in St. John's, and we're delighted today to offer another session in our Continuing Education for Clergy program. We've been doing this now for since around this time last year, and look forward to continuing with at least monthly sessions. I might mention that our next session will be March 9th. Sister Elizabeth Davis will be doing a session on spirituality in senior years, a story of wisdom, aging, and grace. So, but today's topic is on the theology of money. In a few moments, I'll be handing it over to the Reverend Jeffrey Mitchell and the Reverend Maggie Helwig to lead us through a presentation on the work they've done with and on behalf of the task force of the Anglican Church of Canada on that topic, on the theology of money. We're looking forward to it, and I want to thank them in advance for preparing this presentation and being with us. I want to note for everyone that we record the sessions and then we convert them as has to be done electronically and what have you, and make them available through our Queen's College YouTube channel, so you can tell others that they can view it that way if they want, and the link to it will be on our queenscollegenl.ca website. So I'll just take a moment to introduce the two speakers, and they are, of course, as I mentioned a few moments ago, Jeffrey Metcalfe. Jeffrey is a priest of the Diocese of Quebec, and at the present time working in for the Council of Churches in Canada. And Maggie is an Anglican priest as well in the Diocese of Toronto. Both of them have worked on the task force. I understand Maggie has done some research on this area and some writing in the area, and Jeffrey was chair of the task force. So we're delighted that both of them agreed, and we're very generous in their willingness to participate in today's session. So we're just delighted to have you. And Jeffrey, I'm going to pass it over to you so that your screen becomes the one that everyone will see, and we'll make it easier that way. I need to just make sure I can get that switched now in the way that the way it will work. I have a little problem here making that happen. Just going to have to stand by until I get it. Okay, I think you should get a message in a moment, and you'll be able to be the presenter when you.
Dr. Rick?
Hmm?
Susan's at the door.
One of the presenters are on the phone looking for the link.
Okay, I sent it to her. Tell her I'll attend to it in a few moments. Yeah, I just got a call from Maggie, so we'll get her straightened up in a few moments to get her online. Okay, Jeffrey, we can see your screen.
Lovely. Can you see? You can see my screen well?
Yeah, we can see it here on the computers. I just got to do something to get it set up here on the through the projector in the classroom. But you can go right ahead with your presentation.
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for your interest and for inviting us here. It's really a pleasure to be with you here this morning. I think a little bit earlier in Toronto right now than it might be in Newfoundland, but it's wonderful to be here. So just to, I guess, to start off to say a few things about myself. As Rick mentioned, I'm currently working for the Canadian Council of Churches in Toronto, but I maintain a connection to the Diocese of Quebec. I'm still a priest in that diocese and will be returning there shortly. I'm currently in Toronto working on my doctoral degree in moral theology. And so the way Maggie and I discussed kind of splitting up the presentation today is I'll start by explaining more how it came together and some of the background behind it. And then Maggie will dig a bit deeper into the content. As Rick mentioned, out of the two of us, Maggie's done quite a bit of thinking and discernment about this. Maggie has a parish in downtown Toronto in an area called Kensington Market, which is a place that has a remarkable disparity between wealth and poverty. So it's something that she's well acquainted with. Now, to begin, I'm assuming you can see what I see on my screen. So you'll see here the title page of the document, and I wanted to start here on the theology of money, a resource for study and discussion, because I think it's always important when we read any kind of books that we start with the first words on the page. And I think it's important, especially with this document, that we pay attention to the preposition that starts it off, and that's on the theology of money. And that's an important qualification because this document is meant to be, as the subtitle suggests, a resource for study and discussion. It's meant to provoke dialogue and to get people thinking and to help raise a conversation. It's not an official statement of the Anglican Church of Canada. As you know, we don't, as Anglicans, we don't really have a kind of encyclical way of having social teaching. We process the way we think ethically and morally through dialogue. And so this is the attempt of this document. So this is on the theology of money. It's not the theology of money. And I raise that to encourage you to question it, to question not only our relationship to money, but you know, there might be points in the text that you strongly agree with and strongly disagree with. And when we move into the question period, I'll you know, it'd be lovely for you to raise those things that you find yourself resonating with and those things that you might find particularly challenging. So let's see if I can switch to the next slide here. The Theology of Money document began in an experience that was shared both across Canada and across the world, and that was born out of the Occupy movement, a movement that started, as you know, well, as you may know, it actually started in part from an Adbusters ad, so that's kind of an anti-consumerist magazine run out of Vancouver, and they called in that piece to sort of occupy Wall Street, and people in New York actually took that up, and as you know, they literally took it up. They camped out, and they were there for a while. People took that up as well across Toronto, across Vancouver, Montreal, all across Canada, and in many major cities in the world. And as a church, this struck many of us in part because some of the spaces that the occupiers took were our churches. So I'm going to move here. So this is in Toronto, where I currently am based, and these are some photographs from the Occupy movement there. So there you can see St. James Cathedral, and the park beside the church has become a tent city. And this tent city was there for not an insignificant period of time, and it really raised a lot of questions in the minds of people in the city, but also people in the church. Questions like, wait a minute, Jesus said a lot about poverty and wealth, and the Bible says a lot about money. So maybe we have some common conversations that we might want to have with these folks, and people felt themselves challenged. And again, you can see here the kind of extent of the camp in Toronto, which was accompanied by marches throughout the city. Now, what's interesting?
Yep. Hi, could I just flag that I've arrived?
Oh, great! Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Maggie. So I'll turn it over to Maggie in a few minutes, just to say that if you see in this photo here, you'll notice that the composition of the camps in Occupy tended to be diverse, but they also tended to include a lot of young people. And one of the things that I don't know about you folks, but I hear often in my parishes is, where did all the young people go? Well, suddenly we had young people flocking to church parks to camp out, to talk about poverty, justice, the inequality of wealth. And this caught a lot of people on the Faith, Worship, and Ministry Committee at the National Church by surprise, and they felt like they needed to respond to it. Just to give you a quick statistic, which I have currently lost, so I'm going to skip that. Oh, here we go. So there was a recent Oxfam report that came out on Canada, and according to that report, they say that approximately two individuals in Canada own 30% on the level of wealth of about 30% of the poorest. Now that number has been contested, perhaps unsurprisingly by the business community, who say, no, not 2 people, it's just 5 people. So wealth inequality is a significant issue that Occupy picked up, and the church felt it needed to respond. Now, the task force of Faith, Worship, and Ministry was commissioned, and in thinking about how to put this task force forward, we decided, instead of going the usual route, which would be putting on often academics who have a particular kind of discourse around thinking about these issues, to pursue this question phenomenologically, which is a schmancy word to say that we wanted to look at it a bit more through people's lived experience. So we created a task force of people who were very engaged in their communities, as well as very reflective in relation to this issue. And we began to meet as a committee, and we began by just asking ourselves, what is money in our own context? How have we experienced that in our ministries? How does our parish community deal with it? And because we came from a variety of perspectives, we had social activists, we had diocesan stewardship officers, national church stewardship officers, a bishop. At the time of this document, I was the incumbent of the Magdalen Islands, not too far away from you on the coast. And so we began just reflecting on our own experiences. Maggie Helwig volunteered to write a quick draft of reflecting biblically and theologically on it. And then we met a few more times and asked ourselves, how do we see our own space being shaped by money in the ways that that the document in its earlier stages presents? So thinking about what does a theology of enough look like in our context? What ways have we been shaped in our local context about money? And then through that, the committee asked Maggie to draft the final report, which she did and was beautifully written. And then we just again met to talk about it. We felt that it was both representative of our conversations as a committee, but that it was also a challenging piece. It asks us to maybe think in some different ways about money. Maggie will touch more about this in a minute. One of the things I noticed personally was that we tend, when we talk about stewardship in our parishes, especially to focus a lot on a theology of abundance. But that's one narrative in the Bible. Another one that that will be touched on is what is a theology of enough? It's easy for us, especially those of us who live in privileged places in the world, who live in privileged places in our communities, to talk about a theology of abundance. But by neglecting a theology of enough, we also have to ask who we're leaving out of the conversation when we focus exclusively on that narrative. So at this point, Maggie, are you still there?
Yep, I'm here.
Great. I think I'm going to turn it over to Maggie. Maggie, you may want to say a few things about yourself, and then we'll take it off from there.
Okay. I don't know if it's possible. I don't know if I'm supposed to be visible or not. But anyway, my name is Maggie Helwig. I have worked as an author and a human rights activist before I was ordained. And during the time of Occupy, I had recently been ordained and was the assistant curate at the Church of St. Timothy, North Toronto, which is in quite an affluent part of North Toronto. And I was a lot of the time in the Occupy camp, which was an interesting sort of culture clash, going from the Occupy camp up the TTC to my work in the mornings. I'm now the incumbent at the Church of St. Stephen in the Fields, which is a church in a much more economically deprived, although diverse and gentrifying part of downtown Toronto. And I wrote the first draft of the paper, and one of the bits of feedback that I got from the group is that they needed more scriptural grounding for it. And I was reading Psalm 115 one day, and I thought, this is actually a perfect basis. The psalm is about idolatry, which throughout the Old Testament again and again is identified as the sin, the source of all other sins, essentially, is idolatry. And the way that that psalm talks about idolatry really translates with an extraordinary kind of accuracy into our relationship with the current economic system and the way that the contemporary system operates. Our economic system would have been unimaginable to any of the authors of our scriptures. They're just, we're hopping around in the slides. Could we stay on the psalm? Thank you. They couldn't have had a concept of our globalized economy, but they understood idolatry and described it. If you have a Bible with you, pull out Psalm 115 and read it. But we've selected some of the key verses here. It begins, the Latin title of the song is Non Nobis, not unto us. Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but unto your name give glory. And goes on to talk about idols. Their idols. Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands, which is, I think, obvious. They have hands but handle not. They have ears but hear not. They have eyes but see not. They have noses but they have no sense of smell. And it is this kind of depersonalization, this thing that appears human yet has no humanity, which has no real physicality, that can't touch anything, that can't actually be a part of the world, which is an abstracted representation. Part of what an idol is a representation abstracted from real life. And part of the way our economic system functions is with a really abstracted concept of value, which is all about interest and debt and accumulation and number, and has almost nothing to do with, do real persons have real goods? Do real persons have thriving lives? And we can talk in a lot more detail about how that operates and how the global economic system is so extraordinarily divorced from human lives and human thriving, and becomes so much an operation of imaginary processes of debt, which although we have invented them, powerfully control all of our individual lives in the way that an idol does. They that make them are like unto them. Because as we worked through this, we talked more and more about how we are formed and deformed by the economic system, and we'll talk about this a lot more as we go on, the ways that there are values demanded of us by the money economy which are profoundly opposed to the values by which we are supposed to live as Christians, which are deathly in their effect. The dead praise not thee, O Lord. So again, really would encourage everybody to go read all of Psalm 115 and think about it in terms of the economy and how we relate to the economy. But that was where we started working on this. And all right, now we're getting to the passages where we're talking about the theology of enough. I am actually going to, I wonder if we need to talk a little more about how the global economic system operates, or should we go into, what do you think, Jeff?
Well, why don't you just give I know it's a very complex
Yeah.
system. Do you want to give just like a very brief kind of
Yeah.
two-minuter?
I'll try. I think we need to, because one of the things that came up is we tend to think of money as a neutral tool for counting value. And probably in the very early development of the money economy, that was how it operated. Now it is this enormous global system which depends on borrowing and interest and the generation of essentially imaginary value, and depends on constant growth. It's a system that cannot grow within limits. It must be constantly expanding, constantly growing. There must be debt. There must be borrowing and debt and interest in order to create constantly increasing value. Individuals must incur debt. Nations must incur debt. And this is just troubling in itself, because if there is one absolutely consistent thing all through the Old Testament and the New Testament, in fact, it is that usury is wrong. Debt and interest are a sinful system because they start to make money a value in and of itself. Money just sits there and becomes more money in some bizarre imaginary way that is then enforced on people. And we've built our whole global economic system on that abstraction of money from value, and the determination that imaginary money generated by money just sitting there incurring interest controls how people are able to live. Now again, as I said, this system operates on the basis of constant growth. The global economic system would not work if it could not constantly expand. It's not a system that can stay stable or within limits, which is why we are really discouraged from ever feeling like there is, feeling like there's an appropriate level of human thriving, and that you don't actually need more than that. And we divide the world ultimately into people who have much less than they need to thrive, and people who have vastly more than they need to thrive. And a number of people who are kind of caught in the middle, being constantly told, you have to have more. You're only going to be happy if you have more. You're only going to be safe if you have more. And deeply non-scriptural. I'm going to dispute something Jeffrey said. I'm not convinced that you can actually find a theology of abundance anywhere in Scripture. I think you only see that if you read Scripture through the eyes of material privilege. Scripture has been read for a long time. The people who had interpretive access, the people who are allowed to tell us what Scripture have tended for quite some time now to be people who live in conditions of material privilege. So you look at the way we read it is we read Isaiah, for instance, in this passage talking about everyone can have enough to eat. Everyone can have basic goods. Everyone can have basic food without having to hand over cash payments. And we read that as there's going to be infinite wine and infinite milk and infinite food, and it's a theology of abundance and blah, 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 blah. And what Isaiah is saying is everybody can have enough. Everyone will have enough to eat. Because he's writing in a condition of material deprivation. And he understands the vision of the good life as you have enough to eat, not you have a mountain of wine and milk and food, but you have enough. And we see that quite consistently in Scripture. One of the interesting things about the story of the Exodus is the way that the manna is meant to train the children of Israel in the concept of enough. They have, according to the legend, which is all more or less legendary, come out of the very rich society of Egypt, where they may or may not have participated in the wealth, but they were certainly in a context of wealth, of material excess. And the manna is really specifically a pedagogy of enough. You can have as much as you will have exactly as much as you need. If you try to hoard more than you need, it is going to immediately go bad. And the children of Israel take forever to figure this out. They try to stockpile it, they try to accumulate it, it rots immediately. God is like, you can't do this. Manna will not become surplus value. It can't. That's not how we operate. According to one version of the story, which is in Numbers and mentioned in Psalm 78, the Israelites, sitting around complaining, as they always did, were complaining about how, well, the manna, it's boring, you only get enough, we used to have lots of food, we like it. So God sent them this great mass of quails, and they stuffed themselves with quails, and a bunch of people died. And God's like, there, you see, you happy now? This is what you get. This is how material abundance operates. So the people of Israel are not meant to become a people of slavery and comfort. They're not meant to be a people attached to material abundance. They're a people of freedom and adequacy, of appropriate desire of enough. And that ability to understand and want what is enough is freedom. All through the Old Testament, slavery and material excess are really tightly, tightly related. Material excess is built by slavery, which it literally was, and in fact in many cases still is. And material excess makes us slaves. And this echoes again in Revelation. I'm not going to get into the whole anti-capitalist reading of Revelation because it would take way too long. But it's a fascinating book from that perspective. And in the Lament over Babylon, is incredibly powerful. But the listing of why the merchants of the earth, there's a lot of focus in Revelation on the merchants, weeping and mourning for fallen Babylon, and listing all of the luxury goods of Babylon. And they sound beautiful, and it's meant to sound beautiful, and it's an invocation of all this material abundance, gold and silver, jewels and pearls, linen, purple, silk and scarlet, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oil, horses and chariots, slaves, human lives. It's that sort of, that's what we're really talking about. This list of material goods is finally about the captivity of human lives. It's quite a remarkable moment in context. So that's part of this whole scriptural vision of we are made free by understanding what is enough and by experiencing what is enough. We're not made free by deprivation any more than we are by abundance. but by understanding sufficiency, adequacy. The famous passage from Luke about not stockpiling excess goods, not worrying about food or clothing, which is somewhat utopian. You know, obviously we do worry about food and clothing a lot of the time in the real world because of the way the real world is structured. But that the kingdom vision is, you don't necessarily have a lot in the way of material goods, but you have sufficiency. You have enough to be well and safe, and that's all you need. A couple years ago, I was in Amjinang, Sarnia, the indigenous territory in Chemical Valley, and an elder, I quote in the paper, an elder there who said, you know, the plants and the animals, they're still carrying on the way they're meant to, and the laws of creation haven't changed, but the economy controls everything for us. We have to pay to live on the earth. He says, think about it, we're the only species that has to pay to live on the earth. And that to me is very, very close with the scriptural vision of how we're meant to live as opposed to how we actually live in this globalized economy. There we go again, 1 Timothy. If we have food and clothing, we will be content with these. And now, yes, here's a passage in Deuteronomy about interest. I mean, there we get into interest, because if we are satisfied with enough, according to the terms of the global economy cannot be satisfied with enough. It dictates that we as individuals, as communities, as nations, must consume beyond our needs, our means, in order to place ourselves in debt. Value cannot increase without debt and interest. So we have an economic system which absolutely depends on interest, which Scripture is just absolutely unambiguously condemns. You can list passage after passage after passage. You know, there's a few of them on the PowerPoint, but it goes on and on. I mean, all through the Scripture. It's like, what's the one thing that's wrong? Usury. What's the one thing that's wrong? Charging interest. Get it, people? Okay? Charging interest. Not good. There's hardly anything that's clearer in because it's in the system of usury that money escapes from being a sign of real goods for human thriving and becomes a thing in itself which we have to serve. And this ends up creating a system of deep inequality. You know, there's all kinds of statistics about economic inequality that I can quote, and you've probably heard a lot of them, but it's about a small minority of people having far more than they need, and many, many people in the world on varying levels unable to live adequately human lives. Children going to school hungry, people who are homeless, people who are insecure in their housing, crushing debt, inability to access health care, economic anxiety, literal slavery, because there is still literal slavery going on in the world in the production of many of our goods, in sweatshops and coffee plantations and assembly lines in largely the developing world, although to some degree here as well, precarious employment, human lives which are serving the economic system rather than basic human good. And this is the situation in which we find ourselves, a situation of idolatry and enslavement.
Now, Maggie, I'm wondering if you know, so you've spoken about a bit about you know, how the economic system works. You've talked about kind of a counter-biblical example, a theology of enough, and and you know, for our society, a really challenging idea, the idea that there might be a problem with interest. I'm wondering if you might juxtapose that with what we're seeing on the screen right now in this passage in Deuteronomy and this idea of the Jubilee. What does the Jubilee speak into this situation, and what, you know, if we were to reflect back on a passage we kind of skip past, I'll go back to it in a moment, on that initial community of apostles in the book of Acts. You know, what witness do you think these kinds of passages bring to our present situation?
Just before you start to, before you respond, Maggie, Rick here, if you could turn on your webcam, we'd be able to see you, up to yourself if you want to do that, but I'd like it if you would. Continue on with your answer.
Oh, there we are. I'm not sure anybody actually needs to see me, but I will.
Okay.
I'm trying to turn it on.
Okay.
I've got the preview here. Here we are.
Ah, here you are.
There we are.
And we'd done the welcome before you arrived, but again, now that you're here, obviously, welcome, and we really appreciate your participation in today's session. Great. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Sorry about forgetting to turn the webcam on.
No sweat. Anyway, I'll let you continue on with your comments on Jeffrey's question.
Yeah, well, the passage in Deuteronomy is one of the many systems which the Old Testament law built in, because people clearly were charging interest. So the law built in structured systems of debt forgiveness, so that in regular cycles any debt that had accumulated was canceled. So no one is trapped in debt. You may experience debt for a period. If you're able to pay back what you have borrowed, debt's canceled, we're all good, we move on. If after a period you're not able to pay it back, the Old Testament law accepts that you're not able to pay it back. Whatever the conditions are that make that impossible, we don't want you trapped in these conditions. So on a regular recurring cycle, we are going to have debt forgiveness. It's wiped out, we all start clean. And that's a concept we have clearly forgotten about. Forgiveness is hardly imaginable except on tiny individual levels. That would be the only place you'd ever seriously see a system of debt forgiveness, but it's structured in the Old Testament law. And yeah, the Acts passage, well, again, it's the basic vision of a human community with sufficiency, with interdependency. It's one of those passages that, you know, you will see preachers get up and say just embarrassing things about. One church I attended at one point, this reading came up in the lectionary, as it does, and the priest got up and said, well, you know, I mean, this is all very well, but we can't do this in some kind of communistic or hippieistic sort of way. They were, you know, sharing the love of God. Well, no, it's pretty communistic, and if one is to use our, but again, the vision of sufficiency, of interdependency, of people not competing with each other for resources, of the economic system as one in which the aim is the general thriving of all, rather than the tremendous success of some at the cost of the suffering of others. And there's Basil the Great. If you're not familiar with the Cappadocian theologians, get familiar with them, because Basil the Great, Gregory Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, they are some of the greatest theologians that our tradition has produced. But wonderful passage from Basil. I mean, you can see it, but I'll just read it. Tell me, what is your own? What did you bring into this life? From where did you receive it? It is as if someone were to take the first seat in the theater, then bar everyone else from attending, so that one person alone enjoys what is offered for the benefit of all. This is what the rich do. They first take possession of the common property, and then they keep it as their own because they were the first to take it. But if every man took only what sufficed for his own need and left the rest to the needy, no one would be rich, no one would be poor, no one would be in need. He who strips a man of his clothes is called a thief. Is not he who, when able, fails to clothe the naked, worthy of no other title? The bread which you do not use is the bread of the hungry. The garment hanging in your wardrobe is the garment of him who is naked. The shoes that you do not wear are the shoes of the one who is barefoot. The money that you keep locked away is the money of the poor. The acts of charity you do not perform are so many injustices that you commit. Or in summary, property is theft. So, you know, one of our great theologians was saying that in the 4th century, when the economic system wasn't anywhere near what it's like now, and it's still very much worth paying attention to. What are we? I actually can't see which David Frimmer quote we're putting up here.
Oh, sorry, my PowerPoint is briefly melting down.
That's my fault. Yeah, so the David Frimmer is a Lutheran theologian, is talking here about, and this I think is sort of the next big theme we're moving into, how being part of this system shapes us and deforms us, how the choices that we can make are very much restricted by the system in which we live. The market controls so much of what we can do and what we can think and how we can act, that we are being shaped in our being by the values of the market, which are not the values of Scripture.
I wonder, Maggie, here if I can interrupt to just tell a quick story that I think, to me, illustrates this, and you know, is also a challenging encounter that I had in my ministry. So while we were working on this document, I was the incumbent of the Magdalen Islands, which some of you may know is in an archipelago in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and approximately about 90–95% of all my parishioners were lobster fishermen. And I remember one day asking why it was that all the lobster fishermen you know, weren't allowed to pull out their traps until about after 4:30 in the morning, or sorry, 5:30. So they had to leave at 4:30 to get there in time. And I remember saying, like why that time? Like, how did that get selected? And what the fishermen explained to me was that prior to making a legal time, so they'll, you know, the fisheries and oceans department is, you know, hovering above them in aircraft, making sure they're not pulling out their traps, or they'll be fined or lose their licenses. And what they explained to me was we don't have a choice, because if we don't go and fish out our traps, well, other boats on the island will, and they'll get more. And my response was, well, okay, but how does that affect you? It's like, so what they explained was, because everyone was constantly going, you know, as early as possible, you got to the point where you had fishermen before they put in this law who were fishing so many hours that it was becoming dangerous, that people were risking accidents, people weren't getting enough sleep, because they constantly needed to pull out their traps, because they were afraid of you know, not having the as much as their neighbor. They're afraid that their neighbor's prices might affect theirs. And so as time went on, this became worse and worse until finally they realized they needed the government to intervene and to make a law that would just prevent all of them from taking out their traps before a certain time. And this law has to be policed because people will still try to occasionally sneak out and get a head start on their neighbor. But to me, this is a real real kind of eye-opener, a real glimpse into seeing how you know, the forces that drive us to go beyond enough. You know, we can name those market forces to some extent. That they shape us to do things that can be harmful to us and can be harmful for others. You know, some of my parishioners told me at times that, you know, they didn't want to go out before these laws were made. They really hated it. They loved, some of them loved the law because it made it so that they were safe. They didn't have to worry about that level of accumulation. So I always wondered, though, and I asked them, and they didn't really, people didn't always have a response, but, you know, what would have stopped you from just not going? You know, most of the time the response would be something along the lines of, well, then others will fish more lobster than me. You know, I won't have enough. So I think, to me, that just, I lost the PowerPoint briefly. To me, I think that illustrated in my own parish context the ways in which market forces can direct, in the way this sense of not having enough can shape us into making choices that we even know aren't good ones necessarily, that harm us.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, yeah, we thought that one way, at least, of looking at how our choices are shut down by the market economy is comparing some of the values of the market economy or the operations of it or the way it makes us act to our baptismal promises, which are, one presumes, these are expressing the core of who we are supposed to be as Christians. That's certainly the intent of our baptismal promises. Will you continue in the apostles' teaching and fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in the prayers? And we tend to, I think, when we say that in a baptism, sort of go, oh yes, this means that we're supposed to go to church. Go to church, have communion, say some prayers. This is a direct harking back to the community of Acts. This is verbatim from that passage from Acts. So what we're actually promising is that we will strive to be part of a community of sharing, of interdependence, a community in which we strive to ensure that everyone has what they need and that no one has too much. It is a promise to live in an economic relationship with each other which is about care and community and interdependence, and which is really absolutely opposed to the kind of relationship we are supposed to have with each other in the global economy. So we could move on to the next one. Will you seek and serve Christ in all persons? Will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? I think it is fair to say that most of us try to do this. You know, most people take this baptismal promise quite seriously and attempt to live by it. But if you're living in the money economy, it becomes very difficult. If you're living in a world which measures people by their efficiency as economic actors, which the money system very much does, and anyone who's not an efficient economic actor is going to be pushed outside, is going to have a very difficult, very tenuous life. The very old, if you look at the way we treat the elderly in our society, they are no longer efficient members of the economy. and they are very vulnerable, and they are very dependent, and they are very marginalized. People with disabilities. I happen to have a daughter with a serious disability who is never going to be an efficient economic actor. And I can tell you the experience of that marginalization, of that sense that she is unimportant to the world because she cannot participate economically, teaches you a lot about how we measure people and how we treat people. Many of the people I encounter in my daily ministry are struggling with mental illness, with post-traumatic stress, and all the ways that they have tried to deal with that post-traumatic stress. Many victims of childhood abuse. They're not very efficient participants in the economy. And because of that, they are excluded, they are marginalized, they are looked down on, they are not given opportunities, they are not given adequate lives. And this is how the economic system measures and treats people. And it is in absolute opposition to this very central baptismal promise. So individually, I think we really do try to live by this promise, but our system makes it nearly impossible because these larger forces are pushing out and marginalizing people who are inefficient participants in the economy. Can move on to the next one. This one was recently added. Many of you probably did not have this promise at your baptism. Some of us were baptized according to the Book of Common Prayer, so we didn't say any of them, but they still apply. Will you safeguard the integrity of God's creation and respect, sustain, and renew the life of the earth? Again, very important, and I think we're seeing people increasingly trying to be individually responsible in this. But the economic system, as we talked about, requires unlimited, constantly growing material production and disposal. It requires cheap, shoddy consumer goods that need to be replaced rapidly. We make computers that only last a few years. We make clothing. We make shoes. We make everything we make, really, except very few exceptions, is designed to wear out quickly so that we need to replace it quickly. We live most destructively in a hugely fossil fuel dependent economy, which, and I think this is accepted more and more by most people who aren't actually Donald Trump, destroying the possibility of continued human life on this planet. And breaking out of the fossil fuel economy means actually contracting our production. It means living very differently. It means doing this on a very large scale. And doing it on that large scale is the only way at this point that we can safeguard the integrity of God's creation. We are at a very critical point with this, and I think that is increasingly recognized. And small individual changes, while important, are not going to be enough. So now here exactly we're talking about small individual changes because those are what are within our power. And we need to make those as well. We need to train ourselves in scriptural economic practices. We need to train ourselves to live according to scriptural values rather than the values of the economy. And I do see people working on this. We're becoming more aware of how much food we throw away while people are hungry. It's horrifying, really, the amount of food that just gets thrown away on the individual consumer level, at supermarkets, at restaurants, and there is more attention being drawn to this now. So it's simply not throwing food away is a surprisingly radical practice. Growing food, producing food, repairing things rather than throwing them out and buying new ones, using libraries, riding bicycles, using public transit. saying, I don't need to buy another X. I have enough already. People become surprisingly disturbed when you do that. But these little individual practices are important. They're important in training ourselves. It's also important to take on the system. Not everyone's in a position to camp out in a cathedral yard for 40 days. But we need to start looking at the systemic changes which are required, and we need to start looking at how do we make those changes. I live in Toronto. We have an incredibly poorly funded public transit system. People are increasingly not using or unable to use public transit because the system isn't adequately funded, so it's always breaking down and it's always overcrowded, and it's a huge disincentive to people to use public transit. How do we just go about trying to convince people that properly funding our transit system is actually part of continuing to exist as a human race on this earth? And that's, properly funding our transit system would mean a very small increase in property tax for homeowners. And no politician currently has the courage to say, we're going to make this actually very small increase in your property tax so that people can take public transit rather than driving their goddamn cars everywhere. One little example of the need to take on systems at municipal, at provincial, at federal, at international levels. We need to make the little individual changes. We need also to participate in addressing the larger systems. It's linked. They go together.
So on that, I just want to give two experiences, again, from my own time in my parish in the Magdalen Islands. The first was, to your point about refusing to throw away food. One of the islands I served, Entry Island, is about 2 kilometers squared. There's no road access. They do have a recycling depot, but what they didn't have was any kind of composting system. There existed one on the rest of the islands, but not this one because of the fact that there's no road access. So one of the things we decided to do as a parish was create a community garden program, and part of that community garden program was to discuss how would it work for us to partner with the municipality and to look at ways in which, as a church, we might be able to help create a compost system for those on the island who would like to use it. Now there are a lot of people on the island. Like I said, there's about 60 residents, so there aren't a lot of people on the island, but there are people on the island who do already do some of their own composting. So one of the ways we decided to do that was to help those set up composting systems in their own home, and also to have a composting system as part of this community garden project. Now, the other piece about the community garden project is, often community gardens they function by each person having their own kind of private individual plot. That's one way that community gardens can function. But we decided, thinking about some of these scripture verses as a community, that we were going to do things differently. So we decided that rather than having kind of shares, we would use that parable in the Gospel of Matthew, where you have the workers who arrive at different times, and each worker is kind of transgressively assigned a similar kind of wage, no matter when they showed up to help. And so we decided to take that as our model as a community garden. So what we would do is rather than keep kind of track and rate people's work on a monetary value scale, that we would just give away all the produce to everyone on the island. So we split it up into bags, harvested. Not everyone participated. There were a lot of people who received the gift of food, who didn't necessarily work towards the garden. And I think that's actually a very good thing, because a lot of those people were seniors, were homebound people who would love to help, but you know, as Maggie said, they may not have the physical capacity to. And so I think, again, we can start modeling in our parishes. You know, what would it look like in our parish community garden, in other forms of our ministries, if we said, you know, let's have a model where you know, the gifts that God have given us will be accessible to all, and to all equally as they have need.
Yeah, so here we've got another list of possible things. It's really, really hard to get out of the interest economy. One of the things we have to face here is that we are trapped in a system of structural sin, and we can't just get out of it. We can't just say, well, we're going to live entirely outside this system. It's not a realistic option for more than perhaps a very, very tiny number of people. So we can't, at this point, get out of an interest-based economy, but we can decline to participate in certain kinds of interest-based investments. We can invest in credit unions. We can at least examine our investments for ethical, social, environmental value, rather than simply what's generating the largest amount of interest, what's generating the largest amount of value. We can connect more directly with producers, community-supported agriculture programs, other forms of local small production, participate in or buy from workers' cooperatives as far as we're able, or any cooperative social institutions. And there are a number out there. There's many ways that we can participate in institutions that are trying to operate according to alternative models. We can't necessarily run our whole lives that way, but we can look for opportunities to be a part of that. Okay, I wasn't sure, I couldn't remember what was on the next slide, and I haven't got them on my computer, which is silly, so I would have gone on a little more at length in the last slide about the importance of, those of us who are participating in this, I think by definition we are reasonably efficient economic actors. We are participating with some reasonable amount of partial success in the economic system. Not necessarily, we're not the big winners in the economic system, but we're making our way. It's really, really important for communities to include the inefficient economic actors and to start to understand the value of those people. Churches are a place where this can happen, one of the few places left in our society where this can happen, where it is possible to be in community with the very young, the very old, the disabled, the mentally ill, the struggling. We have models like L'Arche, where people with serious disabilities are the core members of the community, and other people are challenged to come into this community and live according to their values, live at their speed, live with their priorities, and understand how that shapes you as a human being. And those people who've had the opportunity to live in a large community for a while can tell you how dramatically it changes your understanding of yourself as a human being. I think for us to start being able to disentangle ourselves spiritually from the economy, it really requires not only spending time with, but valuing and prioritizing the people who are the failures in this economy, because there is extraordinary spiritual value there. So then we're sort of easing into the subject of people who are in fact very much marginalized, and there are many, many, many. Most of us are to some degree losers. You know, we're mostly the people who are kind of in the middle here. We're winning a little bit, we're losing a little bit. So we have the ability to understand a bit of both of those aspects. But for the people who are really struggling, disadvantaged, marginalized, suffering, a theology of enough is about being able to experience material goodness. If you are poor, most of the stuff which you are going to have or interact with or be exposed to is going to be cheap and nasty and shoddy. You're not actually going to have an opportunity to experience the goodness of the created world, and that's important. Little tiny thing. We have a Friday night drop-in all night at the church, and because I care a lot about fair trade, I buy fair trade coffee for the drop-in, and people are amazed because drop-ins are struggling. They're operating on minimal resources. They're doing the best they can, but the coffee's crap. Because it's not because they have bad will, but because that's all they can afford, and that's kind of what's regarded as normal, is this lousy, slave-produced, nasty coffee. And for people to have an actual nice cup of fair trade coffee, that's important. That's important, that people should be able to have good food, that people should be able, as far as possible, to have fresh food at any meal program I've worked at. The excitement if there's fresh fruit or vegetables. Because it's not that marginalized people want to eat crap, it's just that that's all they get. To be warm, to be dry, to have privacy. Privacy when you're economically marginalized is so hard to come by. To have beauty. And again, that's part of what the church has tried to offer. The slum priest movement, the Anglo-Catholic revival, much of that was about trying to provide an experience for economically marginalized people of beauty that's available to everyone. You don't need either financial capital or social capital to come into a church. Even if art galleries and museums were free, which at least in my city they're not, the social capital you need to walk into an art gallery. You feel like you have to be wearing the right clothes, you have to look like the right sort of person, or security is going to be all over you, and they will. But you don't need social capital to come into a church. So again, this is where we can have a role. Provide privacy, provide beauty, provide space for contemplation, provide all of these things that people who are very marginalized by our economy so rarely have a chance to experience.
So, okay, I think can people hear me? Hello?
Yep.
Hello? Okay, great. Thank you, Maggie, for that. I think, you know, we're well into our time. So maybe what we'll do now is if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask. One thing I'd like to say for that is, you know, this document and this discussion is really just it's about dialogue, and it's about challenging ourselves and each other. And if you have any thoughts or feedback about it, I really encourage you to contact Eileen Scully at Faith, Worship and Ministry. I've put the contact information at the bottom of this screen, the email address and the phone number. Yeah, and just feel free to tell that committee you know, what you think, what you found helpful, what you didn't find helpful, and the kinds of work like this you'd like to see in the future. I know that they really appreciate that. So now I guess I'd just like to open it up if there are any thoughts or questions, or Maggie, if you have any other comments you'd like to say.
Hi, I just want to, first of all, thank you both for the wonderful presentation. We'll have questions in a minute. I just want to say that Rick had to leave. He's going to an awards ceremony. His son is getting an award. So I'm Michelle Revaudou. I teach here at Queen's College, so he asked me to thank you both. And now let's open the floor for questions. Anyone? Thoughts? Sharing of experiences? Anybody online wants to ask a question?
Has everyone run away in terror?
No, we're all very thoughtful. Actually, most of the students who are here in the class are, I'm teaching a course on theology and pop culture this term. And of course, money is one of the big issues that we talk about frequently in the context of pop culture as well. So anybody want to make a connection to anything that we've talked about in the class?
You spoke about, you know, the harmless, the homeless, the disengaged people, but yet there's no solution or even a compromise, whereas they can sustain themselves or even meet the criteria. You talk about having a compost, you're having community gardens. That still is not hitting the level that is really the big part of it, is the ones who are not able to even come above where they are. So how do we get them to be able to understand and appreciate life? They appreciate it now for so long because that's all they have. And they don't even think about the fact that maybe we should get somewhere better. Is there anything that, you know, an approach or any kind of a way that you can evaluate that and try to find something that would be able to get them to believe in themselves again? I mean, I know lawyers and doctors who have become alcoholic and end up on the street with no clothes. So, I mean, those things are one thing, but then I've seen, you know, wealthy kids who are from families who are rich who end up underneath what do you call those crossroad things, bypasses underneath the, you know, in those that live, and that's their choice. But the ones that hadn't had a choice, where do you go?
Maybe I'll take a first crack at this and then throw this over to Maggie. So, you know, I think when we speak about things like, you know, growing community gardens, I mean, in my context in the Magdalen Islands, a community of 60 people, you know, there wasn't such a thing in the Magdalen Islands as homelessness. It didn't exist. And it's not because there weren't people who had no work, who were facing a hard time. There definitely were. There were people who were completely unemployed. But the thing is, in the Magdalen Islands, there's still a premium placed on social solidarity. So you know, it's a small community and people know each other and people grew up together. So even if you've fallen on hard times, homelessness in the Magdalen Islands doesn't exist. because you will be housed. And it's happened that people have built houses for other people who otherwise wouldn't be able to have a place to live. Now, I realize in a small community like that, it's a very different kind of situation than a big city like Toronto. So when we're doing things in those kind of small rural settings, I think, things like community gardens, I want to be very clear that that these aren't necessarily for the sake of those who are most marginalized. I think these are ways in which we help to retrain ourselves to think economically in different ways. So in the case of this specific parish, it was a way of challenging ourselves to not think that, your distribution of your food should be connected to your ability to work for it, right? In this case, it was no. If you are a human being, you deserve access to food, and some people in our community just aren't able to work for it. So that wasn't about creating a system just to distribute food to those who have need. I think it was just as much, if not more, training us to rethink about how we reuse and consider our resources. And the other thing I would push back on a little bit is just to say that, Maggie, I'm sure we'll speak about this in a minute, and has had much more experience working with marginalized people on the streets than I have. I've yet to meet a person who chose to live on the streets. There are all kinds of systems, structures, mental health illnesses, traumatic experiences that make it difficult for some people to be housed. I personally, I think it's and politically always better to err on the side of mercy, because we just don't know what other people have faced. But Maggie, I think you have more experience in this than I do.
Yeah, I spend a great deal of my time working with people who are homeless or insecurely housed. The single biggest reason people are homeless in Toronto is that there is no housing. The waiting list for affordable housing is years long. Many people are on the waiting list. We don't build housing because it's not considered a priority, because low property taxes are considered a greater priority than providing affordable housing for people who do not have very much money. But obviously there are other factors. I think the word choice is a really relative one.
Exactly.
It depends what you're choosing between. If your choice is staying in a family which may look like a very well-off, respectable family, where you are being systematically abused, living under a bypass may look like a pretty reasonable alternative. So in that sense, yes, it may be a choice, but it's a choice between two really poor options. And the need for a better option is really what's closing down the choices here. And I mentioned childhood abuse because anyone who works in this field can tell you the single greatest determinant of homelessness, of addiction, of all these ongoing problems is childhood abuse. It is massively predominant in the life experiences of people who are homeless and marginalized. So that's a huge thing we're failing to address. And it's not, again, not really about choice. It's about, out of a couple of bad options, what do you do? And then what do you do with the post-traumatic stress? And that is how many, many people end up in a cycle of addiction. The other big drivers are mental health issues, which our system handles extremely poorly, and acquired brain injury. People who may have had on-the-job accidents or traffic accidents and who come away looking like they're still okay, but they no longer have adequate executive function to carry out a job. And they may get jobs and lose jobs and nobody understands what's going on. And acquired brain injury is really, really common in the marginalized population. So these are all people who are really struggling to make good choices in a system which shuts down their range of choices very dramatically. Because if you can't hold a job, if you have post-traumatic stress, if you have acquired brain injury, if you're struggling with an addiction, if you can't hold down a job, you are not important in this system. You need to be able to do a productive job to matter. If you can't do that, you don't matter, and you are going to be living on the scraps of society, because that is how we have structured our society. Not because that's the way a society has to work, because that's the way that we collectively have chosen for it to work. And actually, I will go back to how do you help people believe in themselves, because that too is important. If people have been abused, if they have been marginalized, if they have had all kinds of experiences which make them feel that they are not worthwhile, which I can tell you most marginalized people have pretty much been made to feel. Having places where people can be safe and warm, where they can have good food, where someone can listen to you, where someone can be a companion, be a friend, earn that friendship. It's not going to fix things. It's not necessarily going to turn people into efficient economic actors, and that's not the aim. But it may help to heal people's souls.
I've just been thinking about the concept of the abstract value of money, and if we reduce money to the value of what can be tangibly valuable, food, clothing, shelter, those things that everybody needs and we can actually put a value on, then where does things that have subjective value fall into if we're with money? In an ideal world, can money be used in a way in an ideal world in order to put value on things that are subjective in value, like art and performance and anything else that is not necessarily appreciated equally by everyone? Where can money fall in that society any better than it currently does?
I would say in an ideal world, you don't need to put a money value on it, because in an ideal world, things would not be measured by their money value. They would be measured by their value to human beings. So art and beauty and all of these incredibly important things would be recognized as important because they matter to people, because they enrich people's lives, because people care about them. And in an ideal world, it wouldn't be necessary to say, this is worth X amount of money and therefore has value.
Yes. Then you run into a problem. You run into the issue, okay, well, you've got people who are producing food and they have particular value because what they're doing has a particular monotonal value. The food has a definite value that's agreed upon by everyone. But if someone's creating music, then that's subjective. Some people might not like the music, some people do. How does the person who only creates music survive? How do they participate in the value of society in terms of...
Well, again, you're still imagining a society in which you get a reward for performing a task.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how the society is structured. You're not imagining a society in which you are given what you need to have an adequate life because you are a human being. And in a society like that, you have what you need to survive because you are human, because people share, because you're a cooperative society who look after each other, and then what you do with your time depends on your particular skill, your calling. Do you grow food? Do you make music? But the fundamental measure of do you deserve a decent life is, are you alive?
Well, this
it's very utopian. It's very utopian. We're a very, very long way from that. But if we can start disentangling our thinking from you get reward for doing a task, and if you don't do a task, you don't get reward. If we can start to think differently about human beings and what human beings should have, I think that might help.
Oh,
Hi, excuse me. Hi, my name is Holly. I'm doing the Master of Divinity program here at Queen's. And I've spent the majority of my life living in, I guess, what would be considered for Ontario standards anyway, a rural environment here in Newfoundland that can have a pretty broad definition. And with the economic situation that we have in Newfoundland right now, since about 1992, what we're seeing, in my opinion, I taught for about 15 years, and what I observed over my teaching career, and even more now as I'm studying theology, is the emergence of invisible margins in the rural society, where, like the Magdalen Islands, the community that I come from, homelessness is pretty much non-existent. But that doesn't mean that people aren't marginalized by any of the factors that we've discussed, whether that's poverty, illness, physical disability, whatever it might be. And our government systems here in Newfoundland are getting worse and worse at helping those people who, first of all, are largely invisible in our rural society, and secondly, have fewer and fewer resources. And I think that the rural environment here in Newfoundland has some really unique challenges because of that. Just wondering, outside of the urban experience, what you might have to say, any insight you might have for that type of an environment.
Yeah, so that's an excellent question, and I really appreciate it because I think that's that's more true to my own experience as well. I grew up in a rural community, and that's where I've done most of my pastoral work, and I think you're absolutely right to point out that in many of these remote areas, people might not be living on the streets. But that doesn't mean they have oil to heat their houses. And you can't tell that necessarily from the outside. So, I mean, Maggie might have some more to say about that structurally. What I'll say kind of personally is this is where I think helping to build relationships, positive, non-competitive relationships in your parish is really, really important. So I mentioned Entry Island. Now, Entry Island used to be a place, if you hear the stories of the elders, that it was a place where there used to be a lot of reciprocity. So, your neighbor's net needs repairing, you help them repair theirs. They'll help you repair yours. You put a roof on your neighbor's house, he'll help you put a roof on yours. And as they tell the story, they talk about how, that time when, because of certain government changes and economic changes on the island, money started flooding into the community. So suddenly, people started just hiring people to do things, and that helped to sort of change that reciprocity. So suddenly, you wouldn't invite your neighbor to help with your house because, in fact, you employed someone, and there was a bit of a status in the community about being able to pay someone to do this work. And what happened is over time, as the elders tell it, this created more and more competition on the island. So yes, no one's going to let anyone sleep, on the windy edge of the cliff. But at the same time, there's still a sense in which everyone is still out to try to beat everybody else, catch more lobsters, trying to build a bigger barn, and so on and so forth. And I think as ministers, whether that's as lay people or ordained people, one of the most cultures of cooperation within our community. So when I have a parishioner saying to me, well, so and so, they waste their money, so we have no, they've made their choice, and we don't need to help them. And I think that's a point for us to really push back on some of those ideas and say, well, that's interesting. Well, where do you see that in the Bible? Where do you see Jesus saying, I'll only heal those who first tried to heal themselves? That's not how Jesus works. That's not how that disciple community in the Book of Acts works. People are given as they have need. So I think it lies with church leaders and members to do everything we can to create cultures of empathy, cultures of hospitality, and one thing that I instituted in my parish liturgically that was highly controversial, and I had no idea that this would happen, was shaking people's hands at the peace before during the offering. And this was hugely controversial in the parish because, as some people said, I'm not shaking that person's hand. They think they're better than me. And so, there are small gestures we can incorporate in our liturgies, like shaking your neighbor's hand and being able to wish them peace, that help already to make visible some of the tensions that are in our communities, and also challenge us to say, look, if you have a problem shaking your neighbor's hand, then we need to talk about what it means to receive the Eucharist in that context. And these become points of discussion, and I think we can do similar things in Bible studies and even in pastoral counseling. So that would be my my kind of personal response. Maggie, you might have more to say in relation to the structural issue.
No, I think a lot of what you said is what needs to be said. I'm sorry, my cat is getting in the way. But, I mean, when we talk about marginalization, homelessness tends to come up because it's obvious, it's visible. Marginalization is not a thing that happens only in individual contexts. Entire regions and entire ways of life are also marginalized. I think it's pretty clear that the entire east coast of Canada has been marginalized in the Canadian economy in ways that are incredibly destructive. Rural areas in general tend to be areas which are marginalized. So we go from sort of individual systems to larger systems which create all different levels and types of marginalization, of poverty. And on the question of hidden poverty and how it operates in communities, there's certainly a lot of hidden poverty in urban areas as well. And what Jeff has said pertains many areas in cities too, where people are struggling to get by and are maybe putting up a front of being okay, but they're not okay, they're struggling. And in most of our churches, it's not safe to say that. It's not safe to say, I'm not okay, I'm barely surviving. We need to make our churches places where it is safe to say that, because you know that people will respond not by saying, well, what did you do wrong to create this situation, but by saying, what help do you need?
Yes, that's an important point. Thank you. I didn't mean to infer that only areas have it rough.
Well, no, rural areas do have it rough in very specific and particular ways that we tend to ignore. So thank you very much for bringing that up.
I have a question in terms of social justice activism. Social justice activism is, of course, it will, of course, often make use of the vocabulary of human rights. And the strangest thing is that, human rights discourse is really the most powerful moral discourse in the world today. It's a global moral discourse. But there's kind of, two dimensions of human rights, or what is generally referred to as the two generations of human rights. So you've got the civil and political rights, and then you've got economic and social rights. And civil and political rights, in a sense, are easier for a government to protect because they involve more or less a minimalist government. So the civil rights of life, liberty, private property, and then, of course, the political rights of voting. But social and economic rights are more complicated for a government to deal with because in those cases, even though technically speaking you still have the right, you don't yet have the object of the right. So the government has to, in some sense, create a system of taxation in order to provide the object of their right. And oftentimes what I see happening is people who are really, you could say, a kind of in a neoliberalist position where they want to defend a minimalist government, they'll often use human rights language to put down economic and social rights themselves. So they'll stress that civil and political rights are the most important and economic and social rights are secondary. And so you actually have, because as soon as you start talking about human rights, everybody says, oh yeah, this is a good moral discourse. But you actually have two people who are both using the vocabulary of human rights, and they're falling into the same old ideology. And one side is accusing the other of rampant capitalism, and the other side is accusing the other of communism. So how do you get beyond that kind of, that divisive ideology, which are both using the vocabulary of human rights?
It's difficult. That's a really interesting problem that you raise, and I would say within our church communities we have tremendous resources in Scripture and in the theologies of the early church. Not so easy or appropriate to use those in wider political discourse for obvious reasons. I think you can find very similar teachings in most major faith traditions, so there's something to work with there, in that, in Islamic tradition, in Jewish tradition, in Buddhist tradition, you can find many similar values enshrined, so we can create a broader discussion that way. But it is difficult, in fact, to come up with good arguments in purely secular terms. There are some philosophers. Martha Nussbaum has been trying to do some really interesting work on philosophies of care in secular language, and there are a few other philosophers who are working in this field who are trying to create that kind of language. But it is certainly an unusual language, and one that we don't have a lot of fluency in at this point.
Thank you.
Just on that note, rather than starting with necessarily starting from the theoretical piece, I think, and this is one of the things that I think that churches are uniquely positioned. Instead of starting with the thought, how about starting with the experience of community? I think that once we try to create small, but small communities, I think the experience does something that can clear a space for whatever else might need to follow. But to do it all abstractly only and try to imagine into existence something, I think is rather fraught with difficulty. But I think if there are experiences, I think that can go a long way. Plus the experience, if you do it, has the actual potential of actually addressing the needs of the people before we formulate the theory. So.
Yep, and yeah, I think the paper is written in a very abstract way because we were hoping it would be a resource that could be used across a lot of contexts. But the whole idea is for people to look at the paper and talk about, what does this mean in my context, in my community, in my experience, to use it as a jumping off point exactly for examining these particular experiences and particular communities and particular contexts. Because I agree, that's where everything comes from. That's where everything comes from, is that basis in real lived experience.
Is the paper now on the Anglican website? On the Anglican? Okay, thank you.
Okay, great.
One of the concepts in Oh, in the environmentalist movement is the idea of globalization, that in fact to think global, to more effectively think globally, we have to start acting locally. And this means, really creating real community in a small way. And nobody really has a vision of how that's going to play out globally, but that's kind of where we have to start.
Yeah, I think it's a both and always, because we are, we are local creatures. We're finite. Human beings are the kind of creatures that we, I'm sitting in my room right now, and you are sitting in a classroom or perhaps in your office right now. So we are located in a space, but there are so many more wider contexts that help to determine this space that I'm currently in. So I think you're right. I think we have to be thinking globally and locally at the same time. These two always have to go together. But personally, when I look at just the global situation, and stepping back maybe a little tiny bit from money, so my doctoral research is in refugees. And when you look at the global situation, let's face it, it's a pretty hopeless one, right? The only thing that can stop these huge flows of refugees at this point is very tall walls. And we have political leaders in Europe and the US who are really happy with building walls, as we've seen. Now, when you look at just that, it can feel very hopeless. And this is where I think, for me, I see this as incarnation in a sense, where we can help find hope locally. So, in my case, that looks like helping to welcome refugees in this city of Toronto. There's a movement in the Anglican Diocese of Toronto where some people are actually inviting refugees into their homes because, as Maggie said, there is no space in the shelters. And one marginalized group specifically that this affects, it affects many people, are newcomers to the city. And so for me, seeing the ways in which Anglicans in our city and people of all faiths and no faiths are reimagining how their space can be used to welcome the stranger, that's a local thing, and that gives me hope, which then feeds into continuing to help energize and give us a vision of what it might look like on a wider frame, right? So if we can imagine opening our homes to strangers, in the case of refugees, what would it look like to imagine opening our borders in different ways? And so I think I'm using this analogously in terms of money to go back to the example that's been my own experience, and that's the community garden. We can't necessarily change the dictated prices of lobster in the community that our community is really dependent on. But what we can do is create a local food system through this community. We called it a community garden, but it was actually 3 fields and produced not an insignificant amount of food. So it was a small farm. That helps create a system locally that also has an effect globally. And like I said, also just gives us hope, because we all need in the midst of structural sin to find places of redemption. And that's the story of the incarnation, right? Jesus doesn't come loftily and change everything from the outside. Jesus comes into the structures of oppression, and through that is able to bring hope and life in the midst of darkness.
Thank you. Oh, yes, Don?
With the marginalist, I was just thinking the possibility of developing a Maxwell community system, rather than not, a B.F. Skinner had tried and mentioned. The only difference is they've already had the exposure to the commercialism and so forth in our communities. But isn't it possible to take those individuals out of that area? We can build buildings and so forth that can house 60 to 70 in each building, along with all kinds, with all the money that people spent. I mean, I think, would that be a decent approach or a possible approach in regards to, you know, making them feel that their identity is there rather than they're not a void in our system? I'm done.
I'm having a little trouble understanding exactly what you're suggesting.
Okay, are you aware of a B.F. Skinner?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay, stupid question, isn't it? He has he proposed in his book regarding the Maxwell community. The only difference with Maxwell community, they were not to be exposed to the commercialism, nor the relativism that they have in the communities today, or any day for that matter. They are sort of shaded from that in order to develop, you know, their own identity. It's something like the Amish, you know, only for now they don't, they die, instead of the car reaching forward, they, you know, they were exposed now. But, and that's why it wouldn't work in that sense. But what I'm saying is that, is it possible to change the thought in regards to what Maxwell community really is, but it's a sort of a laying the foreground on the same premise without having to look at they're trying to take them away from the exposure. They've already in the exposure. And how do we give them back their dignity without making it seem that, you know, we are doing something for you and we're doing nothing? I don't know if that made it.
So, yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, I would flip the question a little bit, and I you know, I think you know, our level of resources also to some extent determines our level of responsibility for the system, right? So the more ability I think you have to move in the system, the more ability, you know, the more resources you have, whether that's physical, like financial capital or social capital. I think the more responsibility you have to use that in order to help others. So, so from my perspective, and I'll let you speak on this in a second, Maggie, but you know, I'm much more concerned about, you know, how we as, speaking as like, you know, a white, privileged, middle class, you know, abled, cisgender male who is privileged in every probably possible sense, ordained, that, you know, I have a responsibility to use that privilege in order to help those who don't have the option to use it. So, so you know, I would throw that back out to say I think all of us who fall under those categories have a responsibility to use our resources in order to assist people, but that I think needs to first be done internally. So before we can think, oh, you know, we'll design a system that will help give people, help give those kinds of people dignity and help bring those kinds of people out of poverty. This is where I think we need to move maybe from saying let's make poverty history to like let's make affluence history. Like who are we seeing as responsible? And I think we need to be very careful when we're thinking about solutions that we don't see the poor as the problem, because in fact the poor have the least power in the system. So if you determine responsibility by power to make changes, in fact, well, I think you get what I mean.
Yep.
Could I respond to that?
Go ahead.
You're right about the fact of being internal. We're the social justice in most committees, at least I believe. I was on the church committee out in Saskatoon, and there's social justice. We have various, you know, individuals taking up various posts. And the social justice that they, you know, whether it's the same in everywhere, I don't know. That's why I'm just asking. The social justice that is in their committees, the church committees, are approaching the social justice not on the norm as what you're talking about the marginalized. They go down, they bring their Christmas turkey, you know, and think they're doing everything great for them. Then they don't talk about them for the rest of the year.
That's charity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's not social justice, that's charity. And I think we really need to work as a church at getting past the charity model, because we have, in the more developed history of the church, been super good at doing some nice things for some poor people, and then, as you say, not talking to them for the rest of the year. I think one of the things that's really important, Gregory of Nyssa, in one of his sermons about poverty in his time, because he was 4th century, so it wasn't anything like what we see now, but there was clearly a good deal of poverty, and lepers and various people in difficulty. Says, you know, we shouldn't take care of these people somewhere far away from our common life. We should be sitting down with them and being with them and taking them into our homes and being in their homes. And I think that's part of what we have to think of too when we're thinking about all this, is that absolutely we should be building buildings for people to live in. 100%. We should be building buildings for people to live in. In the immediate, what that's going to take is people paying more taxes, which as Christians we should welcome and see as a good thing and a thing that we support and feel happy about. But it is also about not saying, you know, let's do nice things for these poor people, but we are a community, and what do we have to teach each other? What can I gain from spending time with and building relationships with people who are not succeeding in terms of the current economy? What can they teach me to talk about how we can be community together, and not from, you know, we from our lofty position will give things to you who don't have things, but what can you as a human being teach me about being human?
Yeah, one of the things that is very important in personalist philosophy is the idea that everybody, above all, has to have the space to make a creative contribution. And creative contribution, of course, doesn't mean economic participation, right? It means, in a sense, somehow giving from out of one's personhood, from out, you know, created in the image of God, right? And I mean, to a certain extent, in order to make such a contribution, you need at least the, you know, like you said, the importance of privacy. Time for reflection, you know, money, and I mean enough, right? Just to have space to, you know, be comforted and not worry about whether one's physical body is going to be taken care of. So if we try to stress more that, you know, community based on, like you said, what can the person teach me? You know, what creative contribution can I receive from them? You know, it's a different kind of space altogether. It's a spiritual space, really. I mean, it's not measured by outer things, but it's a spiritual opening. Well, does anyone else have any questions? It's 11:25, and the session is supposed to end at 11:30, I believe. So, anybody online have any questions still? Well, thank you both very, very much. It was a very wonderful session, and hopefully we can continue to do things on this topic and think about things on this topic, and we'll definitely look at your paper, which is on the website. And do you have any last words?
I just want to say thank you for having us, and yeah, continue to, all of us, I think and pray about these issues. As the paper outlines, and as Maggie said, there are no simple solutions, but that shouldn't stop us from trying to find solutions.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. And on behalf of Queen's College, thank you too, in the absence of our provost. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. So can you do the technology? Oh, yeah. No. Okay. Yep. Yeah.
I'm clearly still on here. All right, how do I leave this?